Good morning, and welcome to the September 2024 update for the Spears & Associates Drilling and Production Outlook. I'm John Spears, and I'll be your host for the next 60 minutes. Let's take a couple of minutes, just do some in-house administrative stuff, let some latecomers sign on. So we're recording the podcast here on September 6th, 2024. And I mentioned that only because forecasting is a dynamic process. When we began doing this work, getting ready for the update maybe a couple of weeks ago, oil prices were in the upper 70s. But we wake up this morning with WTI below $70. When we started, OPEC was going to start reintroducing barrels to the market in the start of October. Now they've decided to delay that for a couple of months. So just to illustrate that process of forecasting is kind of a dynamic thing, I think fortunately we ended up on the correct side of some of these decisions that have happened over the past 24, 48 hours. And so our price assumptions and whatnot that we've based the forecast on, I think, are still relevant. So hopefully that will be the case for us all. A lot of what we say here, just as a side, relies upon OPEC and it being effective. And of course, if you look at the history of cartels, some are more effective than others. OPEC's right up there with some of the more noticeable and long-lived ones, like De Beers with diamonds. And of course, we can't forget the Quebec maple syrup producers cartel, which is, I think, still in existence. And of course, there's the famous Swiss cheese union, which also has lasted a long, long time. But perhaps the most notorious of all the cartels was one that started about 100 years ago now, called Phoebus. I think the Greek name for the god of light. This was a cartel among light bulb manufacturers who were finding that as the world was electrifying, they were making these great light bulbs which lasted too long. Their sales were actually going down because there was no replacement business in the light bulb world at that time. So they got together and they said, great, we're going to agree to reverse technology and make light bulbs perform worse than they are so that we can enjoy replacement bulb business. So this was the cartel. Phoebus was the cartel that introduced the term planned obsolescence into the economic lexicon. And I don't think OPEC has anything in terms of planned obsolescence up its sleeve, but it is something that we should all be aware of. First part of the session today, for those of you who are new to the webinar, is that I'll go through a slide deck summarizing the work we've done, the current state of the market, and our updated drilling and production forecast. At the back end of this, we'll have some time for any questions that you might have. So please send those in. We've got a chat box that you can use. You could send them to us directly through our sai@spearsresearch.com website. Some have already come into us, so we'll work those into as best we can at the end if times permit. One final key piece of housekeeping: the slide deck and the supporting PDF and Excel files for this update have been sent out to our DPO subscribers. If someone from your organization hasn't received one and would like to receive that, please let us know. We're sure to get them on our distribution list. And I should say that the discussion we're having today is free and available to the public. The content, of course, is to our paid subscribers, but if you feel like it, you're welcome to link the podcast to any social media you might have, particularly LinkedIn, which is where it's appearing live right now. So please go ahead and do that. You have our permission, as it were, to get that done. Anyway, with that being said, let's get into the nuts and bolts of the forecast. I'll switch over to the slide deck, which we sent out, and get that going. As usual, I'm understanding that the 2025 planning cycle is kicking off and underway, starting Labor Day. And so particularly now we want to spend time not just talking about how we think the rest of this year is going to end up, but sort of where things are likely to settle come 2025. And the forecast that we've just sent out has numbers that now extend through 2030. So end of this decade as well. So a little bit longer term look if for those so interested in that. Now, most of the numbers that you're going to see will, and we talk about, will be nuts and bolts, rigs, wells, footage, things like that. But of course, we have to put that in some context for what's happening to the global oil market. And so, as you're aware, quite a bit of discussion recently about concerns how oil demand is weakening, particularly in China. But just in the context of a general more negative news coming out about slower growth rates in a lot of the more developed countries of the world, Germany, France, throughout Europe, and so even here in the US. So what does that mean to the oil market? Well, two charts on this slide. The one on the left looks at the change in global oil demand from year to year. So in 2023, as you can see, global oil consumption grew about 1.8 million barrels a day. This year it's up about 1.1 million barrels a day, and next year it's forecast to grow about 1.6 million barrels, at least at this moment. Global oil demand is forecast to grow 1.6 million barrels a day next year. So it's interesting to look at that chart on the left-hand side and think about where the news has come from, not just in the past 3-4 weeks, but really over the course of the year. And what we mostly hear about is how oil demand in the OECD, so that's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, so the industrialized world, if you will, North America, Europe, Japan, Australia, and so forth. So the black part of the bar, never much growth last year, less growth this year, but that really hasn't been the market mover. Real market mover in terms of sentiment in oil traders has been the story in China. And so last year, as you can see, the red part of that chart, the red part of the bar on the left-hand chart, China grew about 800,000 barrels a day last year. This year, the number's coming in closer to 280,000 barrels a day, so 35% of what it was a year ago. And so that has really been the reason why the overall consumption number has fallen so much this year, is worries about China and the struggles that it has had in its own economy there. Now, at the moment, China is expected to recover a little bit going forward, so that helps the market be a little bit more buoyant come 2025. But the other unsung hero, as it were, or heroes, as it were, in the oil market are the gray and the yellow parts of that chart, which are other Asia in gray, and then the whole rest of the world in yellow. So those two segments have grew on the order of about 1 million barrels a day last year. They're continuing to grow about 1 million barrels this year, and they can expected to grow at a little bit higher pace next year. So the bulk of the incremental demand that we're seeing in the marketplace is coming not from industrialized countries or China, really from everybody else. And we just don't get much news flow on a regular basis about that whole rest of the world, because of course there's 100 or so countries in there. India's perhaps the biggest, but we just don't get on a regular basis that kind of market moving news, and so we sort of take it for granted. But it is important to note that among the decision makers as to how much oil to be releasing into the market, this whole other Asia, rest of the world cohort is pretty important. And that brings us to the other point I would say, sticking with that left-hand chart, is that you don't see anything below the line, right? We don't see any areas where demand has fallen from one year to the next. And I think that's important to know too. So while we're talking about disappointing demand numbers, it's disappointing in the context of the growth is not what we'd expected. It's not that consumption is actually falling. It's a little different story when we look over on the supply side. Supply, of course, has been a mix both last year and this year, where we have some areas increasing and are above the zero line, and other areas that are falling. So red and yellow on the charts on the right-hand side are Russia in yellow and OPEC in red. So and both have reduced production last year and this year in order to help sustain prices, balance the market, what have you. Black in the right-hand chart is the U.S. So U.S. numbers grew well over 1.5 million barrels a day last year, up about 500,000 barrels a day this year, and a slightly higher growth rate expected next year. The other thing I should say is when we talk about oil supply, both of these charts, we're really talking about liquids. So it's not just crude oil production, it's the combination of crude oil output, natural gas liquids. So crude oil output right now, in the context of a market that's demanding about 102 million barrels a day, crude production is around 88 or 89 million barrels a day. Natural gas liquids, the world as a whole, is somewhere around 12 million barrels a day. About half of that is coming from the U.S. And then there's some bits and pieces, ethanol, like, add to the total change in oil supply. So something to keep in mind, because it is kind of surprising to look at the U.S. portion of the supply chart and see the numbers expected to grow substantial, pretty highly next year. I mean, we're still looking at, these are EIA numbers, by the way, all 3 years charts. And the EIA expects that U.S. oil production, crude and natural gas liquids, to grow on the order of about 600,000 barrels a day next year. Frankly, we don't think that's going to happen. Oil piece, I think, is, the EIA is overstating that by about 50%, as best we can tell, given the current pace with which we see operators drilling wells and production, current and future wells being drilled. So I think we'll probably see some of the supply side numbers, particularly for the U.S., scaled back. Still, Guyana, there's a handful of other places that are making a dent. Non-OPEC suppliers coming on and have been part of that market, and we think those numbers will stay fairly steady. And not much change there. Before I go into the U.S. liquids piece, I just want to take a look at U.S. natural gas. So gas demand in the U.S. This year is expected to total somewhere around 111 billion cubic feet a day, and is expected to go up to about 2% next year to 113 billion cubic feet a day. But the reason for that expectation for the growth comes not from domestic consumption, which is the part in red, but the part in black, which is our exports. So exports are around 21.5 BCF a day this year, both pipeline and LNG. And next year, those numbers are expected to go up to almost 24 BCF a day. So I think we get a pretty substantial kick in export numbers, and that helps bring the overall total up come 2025. Now, what's interesting is, demand in the U.S. this year is growing about, I think, about 1% overall. The two biggest sectors for gas use in the economy are power generation market and industry. Power generation is the bigger of the two. This year, we're seeing about almost a 2% increase in gas-fired power generation. But the industrial sector is down about 0.5 point, which kind of makes sense given some of the news we hear about manufacturing softness in the manufacturing sector. Next year, the EIA's got a pretty negative view for both the power sector and the industrial sector with regard to their use of natural gas. So it's got the power market gas demand falling by almost 3.5% next year, and it's got the industrial market falling by about 7% next year. And their estimate of gas use in the power market is a bit surprising because next year I think there's something close to 10 gigawatts of coal-fired power that are due for retirement. That's a big chunk of the coal-fire market. And it needs to be replaced by something. There's got to be some form of dispatchable, what the utility folks refer to as dispatchable power. So that means stuff that's up and running all day long can be brought on stream very quickly. in contrast to solar and wind, which have environmental issues that may make that power not available when it's needed. So it's dispatchable power, coal, gas, nuclear, hydro, is highly valued, and to the extent that in the context of a power market, which is finding itself on the cusp of a pretty rapid growth rate, the fact that it's poised to retire a bunch of coal-fired dispatchable power means that I think it would rely even more on a gas-fired power plant to make up the difference, as it were. So it's really surprising to see the EIA with a negative outlook for gas use in the power sector. I suspect that they probably overestimated the case, or they think it's going to be a really cool summer next year, burning much power or need much power as we have in recent past. The other part of that power sector coal story is that, yeah, there's 10 gigawatts of power that's due to be retired in 2025. There's something on the order of 25 gigawatts of coal-fired power that's due to be retired over the 2025 to 2028 timeframe. So you've got a lot of that coal-fired power that is due to come upstream. And if indeed it does, I think that's a real boost to natural gas, because I just don't see hydro, nuclear, and so forth being able to increase output very much. There's a lot, obviously, of wind and solar capacity being installed, but I don't think that we can count on that as much of an increase in terms of when you need power that you have when you need it. The other thing I'll talk about gas before we move off of it is, of course, that gas prices have been very soft this year, and part of that, a big part of that story, is the fact that we had warmer than normal weather last year. We ended up with, coming out of winter, something like 450 billion cubic feet of excess gas in inventory. And so the folks, the storage cavern operators, have been busy working that number down. Today, we have about 200 BCF extra above normal gas in storage. Come November, at the end of the injection season, we'll probably still have a bit of a surplus, but it might be down somewhere in the 50 to 75 BCF range. So its numbers coming down, but the way that's being done, of course, is that storage cavern operators are injecting about 20% less gas this year than last year. And so that's one of the reasons why the gas market is soft this summer. In fact, we've seen gas producers reduce their production numbers by about 4 BCF a day in order to attempt to kind of balance that market and respond to downturn injection requirements. So that's helped sustain prices, although it's hard to say that there's been much help when the average gas price at Henry Hub has been below $2 for much of the summer, and the price at the Waha Hub out there in West Texas is negative for, I think, over a month now. So you just got you've got a weak gas market, and it should stay that way until come this next winter, and then I think inventories being back to normal will help improve prices. We'll get to our price estimates in just a second. On the oil production side, NGLs, again, what we're seeing is a bit of a gain this year. There's these are EIA projections, so we'll see how right they are as a forecaster. Up 2.3% this year. Crude, 3.5% gain next year. Right now, over the course of 2024, U.S. crude oil production is only growing, though, at about 1.5% year over year. So so the fact that they expected that 1.5% rate of growth to more than double to 3.5% next year is a bit of a surprise, given what we think is going to happen in terms of both rig count and productivity of oil. And natural gas liquids productions, as I'd said before, we're up to over 6 million barrels a day of gas liquids. This year will be up again next year. And gas liquids production is very much a function of the installed capacity for natural gas processing, because these days about 80% of our natural gas production is processed to recover natural gas liquids. So last year we added, I there was a big jump in, last year we added 5 to 6 BCF a day of new gas processing capacity. And I think we've got similar kind of numbers coming on stream in 2024, and almost the same level of capacity increase on the gas processing side slated for next year. So we're seeing a lot of new big, 200 to 300 million cubic feet a day gas processing plants built mostly out there in the Permian Basin. And that's boosting the capacity to recover natural gas liquids. What's really behind this rising number you see on the side. The other thing that surprised me as I was digging into this, we spend a lot of time talking about exports, right? Now, an exporting nation, gas, oil, and natural gas liquids. So on the gas side, we export about 20% of what we produce. For crude oil, we export about 30% of what we produce. For gas liquids, we export about 40%. So those are the drivers. The foreign markets are increasingly important, I should say, to all aspects of the U.S. upstream. So what does this mean when we get to price estimates? Well, our numbers for this year, I think, are going to end up somewhere just above $79 a barrel for WTI. And at this rate, anyway, we have WTI prices averaging about $80, a little over $80 a barrel next year. So up on the order of about 1.5%. Not much of a gain, but we do believe that OPEC will only reintroduce its barrels to the marketplace in a manner that supports prices somewhere in that $75 to $85 range. Kind of the key break-even point that many of those governments need from a fiscal revenue standpoint. And so I don't think they're, it was almost a year ago now that they picked October of 2024 as the day they would begin the process of introducing barrels to the market. That, of course, was taken at a time when demand was a little bit stronger, looked a little bit different. Today, I think they realized that there's no magic thing to a date that requires them to stick to that. So I suspect that they'll kick the can down the road in 1 or 2 month increments and not begin to reintroduce barrels to the market. Prices have normalized some and can tolerate an introduction of prices to stay in the $75, $85 range. Bravely picked a midpoint price as our average for next year, so $80.50 on the WTI side. Henry Hub this year, as we said, has been pretty weak. This year it looks like an average was going to come in somewhere in the $215 to $220 per million BTU range. We think the price will be substantially higher next year, although it will still be sub $3 a barrel, so $270 or thereabouts as a Henry Hub spot price on average for next year. Problem with that is that if you look at the break-even point for many operators in gas-centric areas, so I'm speaking of Haynesville and Marcellus guys for the most part, they're dry gas wells and pretty much entirely reliant upon the price of natural gas in order to justify new drilling and so forth. But their average break-even point in those basins is still in the $2.60 to $3 range. We're just barely going to recover to the point where the average operator has, the majority of his wells in the black, but just barely in the black. So drilling in those areas, I think, will continue to be fairly weak next year. The Haynesville come down 10% or so, but the Marcellus come down 10% or so in terms of count, but our Marcellus numbers, 30 or 40% range, as the Haynesville ends up really being the swing producer gas market, as best we know, and pretty price sensitive. So, but those are our numbers in terms of aggregates for behind the price. And so what does that mean in terms of rig count? Well, our numbers for this year, we think now will average around 598, let's call it 600 rigs on average here in the US. Currently it's in the mid 580s, and we think it's going to stay pretty much close to that average. Just don't see much in commodity prices moving rig count either up or down next year. So if it was just a function of fiscal impact based on commodity prices, what we see today is what there is perhaps going to be continued pressure on rig activity coming from the combinations, the acquisitions that have taken place among U.S. producers going on 18 months now. Now, the bulk of that, most of that dollars and much of the impact, I think, has already been felt. But we see further M&A deals being done in recent weeks. What's interesting about that is that whereas last year most of the action was in the Permian Basin, very Permian-centric, if you this year we're seeing more of the deals take place outside the Permian, a higher percentage of the deals take place outside the Permian. We've got the Niobrara, we have the Weston, and so to the extent that you've got increased M&A impact in those areas, 2025 may be the effect of that in terms, because it's just a fact that a merger takes place, and the first thing that happens is everybody spends a few months thinking about what are now my list of prospects. Now, how am I going to go about drilled, and who am I going to use to drill those wells? And that some sand in the and takes activity down. So we see about a 2% drop in 2 to 3% drop in terms of rig count year over year come 25, as best we can tell. 16.9 thousand completions this year, 16.6 thousand completions next year. In terms of total footage drilled, 239 million feet of oil. Next year, our footage number goes up slightly, 241 million feet of hole. I think we see the average well depth increasing on the order of about 3%, and that ends up becoming a key point in the forecast, because now we think that operators are going to prefer to increase their reservoir exposure not by punching more holes in the ground, but rather by drilling longer laterals on the wells that they. So one of the reasons why we don't see rig count, well count moving, but we do see footage moving up because of longer lateral jobs going on. I've got a next slide talks about that. But before I get there, just in terms of those of you on the completion side who are interested in about frac jobs, last year we did almost 13,000 frac jobs here in the U.S. This year the number is going to be a little over 11,000 frac jobs. So we've seen frac activity drop about 13% year over year. Next year, again, not much change. Frac activity will be down just a little bit, but still end up just over 11,000 frac jobs 25. Now, again, if you're measuring things like barrels pumped or proppant pumped and things like that, given that you've got longer laterals, more frac stages, next year could actually be up if you're looking at that kind of a measurement rather than just how many jobs themselves are being done. But again, longer lateral length plays a little bit of, it has to be taken into account when we're thinking about drivers of specific product and service markets next year. Here's a slide that we had in our last quarterly report, and it just bears mention. I think it's worth noticing that in every area that we track, that lateral length has been growing. These numbers go from the first part of 2020, and we're projecting them through this year. And of course, on average this year, laterals we believe are going to be somewhere close to 11,000 feet on average, up about 5% from last year. We think they'll be, so they were roughly 10,500 feet last year, 11,000 feet this year, and on average we think close to 11,500. But the average is coming about not because every single lateral is getting longer, but because we're shifting increasingly toward longer laterals. So this chart looks at the breakdown from 2023 in terms of how long are the laterals in different basins, and we've got them sorted under 5,000 foot laterals on the far left-hand side of each of these charts to over 16,000 foot laterals on the far right-hand side of each of these charts. And so what we see is that last year, laterals in excess of 15,000 feet represented about 10% of the wells that horizontal wells that got drilled last year. 2022, laterals in excess of 15,000 feet were 5% of the wells that got drilled too. And so this year the number is going up and pretty substantially. I think by the time the dust settles on 2024, I would not be surprised to see that 1 out of every 5 wells being drilled here in the US as a whole is over 15,000 long. And I think in particular we're going to see this be the case. Those numbers should be higher, I think, basin, because again, last year with all the mergering activity that took place, we now have a number of buyers, buying companies, substantial acreage positions, position themselves then to block up tracks so they can go off and drill a 15, 20,000 foot lateral at the surface area control, as it were, to do that. They're limited by the fence line, 5,000. So that's a big driver of activity. And I think it's particularly in the case of the Permian, seeing much of this manifest. So the numbers, I think, are going to reflect that activity. That's enough for our U.S. section. Don't want to forget the rest of the world. There's some interesting things going on there as well. Canada is seeing activity actually increase this year. We're up about 5% there. So again, they've got the same fiscal environment that we do down here in the U.S. They haven't had M&A activity that's been pressing activity in this year. They've had terrible natural gas prices, but activity's up. And that's a function of the fact that pipeline takeaway capacity is much better condition this year than it has been in the past. Canadian crude oil production is going to be up 200,000 to 300,000 barrels a day this year because of new pipelines that are in place. And that's feeding into the drilling activity happening this year. Next year and beyond, I think the nature of, we expect Canadian drilling to continue to rise. I think our numbers over the course of the balance of the decade, 2025 to 30, are something on the order of 4% CAGR in terms of Canadian rig count. A bunch of that is going to be exploiting the Montney Shale LNG projects. I think Canada's got something on the order of 2.5 BCF a day of LNG coming on stream over the 2025-26 timeframe. And that gas has got to come from someplace. The Montney Shale is going to be that spot. And so that, I think, will help drive Canadian activity up. So we see activity up on the order of about 5% this year, and next year rig count's going to go up another 4 or 5% by our lights. So we'll get to somewhere around over 7,000 wells being drilled, something close to 3 million feet full. The pie chart on the right hand side is just for those of you who may be wondering where are the rigs at work. So about 75% of the activity is taking place in Alberta. So that's covers by central Alberta, foothills, front I should say, east, central, northeast, northwest, southeast Alberta. So that's 73-74% of activity right now in Canada. The foothills being the biggest single part of that and then you get northern British Columbia as a 12% of the market, and East Saskatchewan's another % of the market. So you can begin to see that much of the rig count there is in those areas where they're drilling lateral wells in order to exploit unconventional reserves, and we think that will only become more important as time goes by for the Canadian market. So a big driver of activity up there for a lot of different markets on the drilling side as well as on the completion side. And then international is everything else. So the folks at Baker Hughes count, our international market conforms to their international rig count numbers for the most part. They don't count any rigs in Russia or the CIS. Central Asian countries. We do make some estimates of wells drilled and footage drilled in those areas. It's pretty opaque, but we've got our best guess at what's going on in those two markets. In China, the Baker Hughes folks only count offshore rigs. Clearly, that's a land onshore market, and we've estimated wells, footage, and spending for the complete Chinese market as well. So this slide you're looking at right now, though, just looks at rig count outside of North America and excluding Russia, Central Asia, and China. So, so we've got rig activity this year coming in at about 909 rigs. That's up a solid 1% from what it was a year ago. We've seen, surprisingly, a downturn in activity. I guess the news from Saudi Arabia in terms of not progressing with some of their big offshore capacity expansion projects has been, of course, what we've seen the most of. But other areas have been weak as well that typically have accounted for a lot of rigs. The Colombian market has been one, since the government there is not issuing new exploration permits. Rig count's fallen in Indonesia as well, and so we've been bringing down our international estimates throughout the course of 2024, and where we are today is with looking at a slight uptick in the overall market of about 1%. We get to about 9,500 wells being drilled this year and about 70 million feet of hole as well. Now, come 2025, we're thinking that activity will be up on the order of about 3%, so in aggregate. And the chart on the right-hand side just sort of breaks those numbers down by region. As you can see, this year South America is down fairly substantially. Europe's off just a couple of rigs. The other markets are up, in the mid to low single-digit range, and we think that that'll broadly be the story for next year, that we see low single-digit growth in most parts of the world, if we've read the tea leaves correctly. Now, we do try and break it down for those who are just more sort of onshore oriented. So last year there were 714 active rigs in the international sector. This year 728, so up about 2% offshore. We think there'll be another 3% growth thereabouts on the offshore sector next year. Again, the detail that we sent out in terms of Excel spreadsheets and so forth, you can see what the numbers are for country by country, land versus offshore, rigs, wells, footage, what have you. So to the extent you've got markets in specific countries but not in others, you can see what our estimates are for the markets you're serving. Offshore, again, we've surprisingly, because going into this year, everybody was thinking the offshore market was going to continue to move up and to the right. But the fact that the Saudis laid down about 27 or 28 offshore jackups has really put a dent in the offshore rig count this year. So we're seeing it down on the order of about 3% to about 180 active rigs as per the Baker Hughes count. Rising, we think, next year, some recovery in the market, but disappointing as to most of the disappointment has been centered around the Middle Eastern market when we come to offshore rig count and activity and the like. So now the good news is that the rigs that the Saudis let go have begun to be picked up and are re-entering the market. So, but that takes time, and that's why we're just going to expect to see a fairly slight gain in activity come 2025 in the offshore sector. And then we look at it broadly by country or region by region. So Central to South America, as we'd said, down 8% overall. Colombia, as we mentioned, is making it hard to do more exploration. And of course, if you're not doing exploration, then the whole potential field development stuff begins to dry up. You're just looking at further exploiting existing fields, and that's just a small part of what might have been the case in that country. So Colombia is an area that is going through some of its own problems. Brazil moves from strength to strength. The Petrobras recently estimated that it's going to grow production from Brazil by about 50% by the end of this decade. So it'll be up to from somewhere around 3.3 million barrels a day today to somewhere close to 5 million barrels a day by the end of the decade as they progress through their deep water pre-salt field exploration and development plans. And of course, then the other two big areas down there, the big one right now, of course, is Guyana. ExxonMobil has just approved its next deepwater field development. I think they're calling this one Hammerhead. And if I remember correctly, I think that's number 6 for them. So due on stream come 2028 or thereabouts. They're already in the pre-planning stage for numbers 7 and 8. So that is a pretty well-known story, and with solid growth prospects in place. Suriname is the other one, which is about where Guyana was 3-4 years ago. So Total and Petronas are two big operators down there, and they're getting both close to sanctioning projects, as we understand it. So and together they might have a couple of their projects up and running in 3 to 4 year time frame. So fairly fast track development given the water depths involved. Europe's down slightly this year. Not much action change of note, other than the fact that in the UK, the Labour Party won the election, and that's bad news for the oil patch in the UK continental shelf, because they both want to raise the windfall profits tax. They want to extend its duration, and just in the news earlier this week was the industry association serving that market came out with his own estimate, saying last year the industry spent something close to 15 billion pounds, I should say, in the offshore sector, exploration, development, field decommissioning, the whole yard. That number may fall to 3 billion pounds, given the execution of Labour's policy plans. So, and any projects, there's just a handful of projects that are sort of in the that haven't been sanctioned but are in the pre-approval stage, and it can only, I think the actions that the government takes now, I think, are going to pretty much put an end to any new field development work that's going on there. They're not going to allow for exploration on and new exploration. It's a bad story there. Other than that, in Europe, the story remains the same. Norway is Equinor there has plenty of prospects. It's actively developing many more that it expects to develop, and it plans to drill something on the order of 30 exploration wells in Norwegian waters every year through the end of the decade. So its plans are active and in place for sure. Africa is another market that we're looking at. It's heavily exploration oriented. Coming out of the pandemic, Africa has seen a pretty decent recovery. The problem is that much of the discoveries that are being made are gas oriented, and the issue there is that of the finance for all the infrastructure that's needed. So in the past, a lot of European banks have provided the finance for those kind of projects in Africa. And what we see now, of course, is that any number of European banks are pulling away from fossil fuel exposure in its loan portfolio. So there's a real challenge for some of these projects to where are we going to find the finance, and that's why there's been, you'll see more in the way of announcements and discussion around can we find some Africa-based financial institutions to underwrite some of these projects in order to see them move forward. Now, offshore, Namibia is probably the one that is the most exciting. I think it has a potential that looks a lot like Guyana or Suriname in terms of some massive discoveries that Total, Shell, and Galp Energia have made, and each of them is in getting closer to approvals, sanctioning, projects go ahead. So I think now that they expect to see 4 or maybe 5 of these big production hubs in place by the end of the decade. So Guyana is, I think, about 4 production hubs right now. So that's and producing 450,000 barrels a day. So that's the kind of potential we expect to see from Namibia. Middle East, we've talked about Saudi Arabia already. There are, I think, interestingly, for many U.S. Oilfield service firms, is the question of unconventional resource development that might be occurring or is planned to take place in the Middle East, because you've got Saudi, UAE, Oman, I might be missing one, that have unconventional resources. Much of this would be gas. The idea would be to develop the gas, use it to power their power sector, to gas-fired power in place of crude oil-fired power, so that they can free up crude oil for export. So plans in place, the opportunities there. We'll see how fast it might develop. Asia Pacific's up slightly this year. We think it'll continue to grow fairly well next year. The folks at Rystad, just want to call them out because I think they've done some work which is interesting. They talk about many of the potential projects, gas field projects in Asia Pacific need about a $6 per MCF price for gas. Historically, gas has sold in that area around $4 an MCF, so they need a higher price point for domestic consumers in order to make some of these field development projects go forward. And of course, that's always a tough thing for a government to do, to allow natural gas prices to seek its market clearing level as opposed to a regulated level. But that's the kind of thing that there have been some discussions about, and we'll see if that ends up taking place and leading to the development of some of the discoveries that have been made, because there have been some huge discoveries that have been made that could potentially not only serve foreign LNG, but domestic markets as well. But they need a higher domestic price for sure in order to make that happen. And China is an interesting case. I just want to highlight the fact that they've just formed a new umbrella company to help in the effort to deliver as much of the oilfield supply chain from local manufacturers as opposed to relying upon foreign imports, specifically for the purpose of developing unconventional resources. So that's been a thing onshore, mostly for gas in China, but they've been heavily reliant upon Western technology to get that done, and they want to find Chinese suppliers to take the place of those Western firms. So something to keep in mind, because they too are big on the local content question. And so with that, I've finished the slides I have brought to the table, and I would like to say, to open the floor for questions. In general, my philosophy is that up to this point, we've been answering the what questions, and now we get to answer the so what questions. And so with that, first one I've got is we've heard that cementing services have been discounted an additional 10% this summer, and some rigs are discounting about the same amount, even though the longer term contracts are holding. Widespread is this? You know, I see this kind of thing, when I hear this kind of thing happening, I cannot help but think that this is a function of the consolidation that's been taking place in the market over the last 12 months or so. Because when that happens, we all know that the acquirer gets to choose the suppliers, and generally they bring their supply chain in place of whoever the suppliers are, or a big chunk of the suppliers that the seller had been using. And so this means that you've got certain firms that are on the outside now looking in when it comes to orders and business. And I think the pressure is particularly acute in that situation to discount and try and claw back some business. So I think that's the kind of thing that's going on. And if that's the correct explanation, then I suspect that that's just going to work its way into I don't think it's necessarily going to broaden, that discounting would deepen or expand from where it is, but I think that's the driver of a large part of the discounting we've seen, and might explain why spot prices are soft, but longer term contracts are generally fairly firm, because you've got rigs being employed, and bigger companies love to lock up those rigs and other assets for a long time, and so so that might explain why those numbers have stayed pretty pretty constant for a while, and haven't been as weak as they might have been. Do we have any comments on the well intervention side of the market, coiled tubing, snubbing, and the like? Yeah, that's an interesting thing. There's because as you get into longer laterals, right? Some of the demand really puts a strain on equipment, and I can very well imagine that operators are struggling with and trying to find new ways to solve some of the problems of how do you go about completing a well when you've got 15 or 20,000 feet of lateral to 5 or 10,000 feet. Deal with. One of the things that we hear many operators talking about these days is the high cost of lease operating expenses, and how those costs have been rising rapidly. One thing to pay attention to: capital costs associated with drilling, completing new wells, but the whole exposure and transparency around lease operating expenses is tougher. My suspicion on the broader question of sort of lease operating costs, well intervention, and whatnot, is that those expenses rise as a well ages, and if you're measuring it in terms of dollars per barrel, then we know that production falls over time, so your costs on a per barrel basis skyrocket, especially when we're talking about kind of decline curves that we see for these horizontal wells, right? And such a tremendous drop in production from year 1 to year 2, from month 2 to month 7, right? So I think as this is something that operators are increasingly alert to, the fact that we're not adding and growing domestic production as rapidly as we had in the past means that on average we've got a higher percentage of our production is coming from older fields. And that's, I think, just a huge driver of issue of well costs and what it might mean in terms of well intervention strategies as well ages, kind of artificial lift forms that they take, and yes, so we've got a lot of a couple of other questions I want to make sure we get to. Liberty Energy recently projected that soon the ratio of rigs to frac crews will be 2 to 1 rather than 2.5 or 3 to 1, and it's because of the longer laterals. So rig stays in place for a long time, and in fact, I think we're getting pretty close to that point. It's a good thing to be alert to. It's interesting. If you look at rig productivity, particularly in the horizontal segment, 25 wells per horizontal rig per year has been a pretty stable number for some time now. And when we look at frac crew count, on average, frac crew is knocking off about 48 to 50 frac jobs per year. Stage count's a different thing and rising, but in terms of job count, 48 to 50. So again, you begin to see a 2 to 1 ratio, right? 24 or 25 wells per rig, 48 or 50 frac jobs per frac crew. So you get a 2 to 1 ratio, 2 rigs for every frac crew. Seems to be the kind of number. So I broadly agree with what Liberty's saying there. There is probably a hard limit as to how far you can drill these horizontal wells effectively and economically. So we're going to find that out soon enough. A viewer says, if your outlook is proven correct, I think it will result in flat to down U.S. onshore production. Efficiency gains are in the rear view. Do you agree or disagree? So I think I will say that I think it's very difficult to grow production. I think 2 things. One is that we've only seen output over the course of this year, exit to exit, is only going up 1.5% or thereabouts. So we're much below the 10 to 15% growth rates that we enjoyed a few years ago. Large part of what was due to efficiency. So, I think in an global oil market that is only growing 1.5% per year, best, it would be unwise for U.S. operators to try and grow production faster than that. So yeah, I think 1.5% per year growth rates are probably tops. What we might expect, flat might be like it. The efficiency gain issue is a good point. I think some of the broader measures of efficiency that we think of, wells per worth, may not be changing very much. Clearly, operators are looking for better ways to get things done, and so there's going to be a lot of changes going on the completion side, and I think that will make some operations more efficient. But is that enough to move the needle when we talk about the U.S. as a whole? Very difficult to come by. You know, the bit guys have been with us forever, right? Drill bits have been century old, and I think they would say that that bit improvements could be annualized to get something like a 1% improvement in efficiency over a long period of time. So we're not in the semiconductor stage where we can cut the cost of processing by 50% every 8 years. But even something as drill bits does still see some efficiency gains, improvements, for thanks to material changes and the like. And I expect those kind of things will be with us, but they'll be more like inside baseball rather than big headline. In the frac market, what is the makeup of the fleets, electric versus dual fueled and so forth? Will a shift to electric slow with flat down activity level? So I think, what's the number now? About 15% of the fleet is electric, and dual fuel stuff is, I apologize for not having that number off the top of my head. It's a larger piece, but I don't think it's, and maybe you get about half of it still the standard approach. I don't know if the shift to electric is a very interesting thing, because talk to operators out there in West Texas, particularly the publicly traded ones. They have some pretty aggressive goals to decarbonize their. That they mean hooking up to the grid rather than running a gas engine to power a compressor or a diesel engine to run a pump or something like that. So they're having to do that now because they've gone beyond the grid. They've outrun the grid, ERCOT's grid, and so they're building microgrids. They're renting gas-fired gensets, things like that, in order to meet the power requirements given drilling programs they've adopted. But I do believe that the interest in electrifying operations, broadly speaking, is in place, and particularly on the frac side, you've got some options with regard to on-site microgrids that deliver the 25 megawatts of power that they need. I think we'll see more of that. Liberty and a few others have some standalone options to help electrify pad operations. It's sort of a different thing, microgrid that can then handle the production stuff once you've got pump compressors in place. But I think, broadly speaking, electrification is with us, given hiccups and some of the challenges getting the grid out to where we would like it to be. What are your thoughts about the refrac market now and in coming years? It's always been, that's like EOR. It's always been another $10 higher price would make that economic. Refrac is one, I think, that may be the next area for folks to explore. The way we have a cohort of wells, I would say that the refrac is probably most applicable to wells that we drilled between the years, broadly speaking, 2010 to 2020. About a decade's worth of horizontal wells that were drilled and fracked under a very different approach than we do. And I think that's probably where we're going to see frac go in and frac in between existing frac stages. One thing, now we're talking 50-foot spacing and 300-foot spacing. Right? So there's those kind of opportunities in some of those old. Now you then have to think about, well, who's owning those older wells now, and what they've been producing for a decade, say. So what kind of gain might you get were you to be able to come back and refrac? And that's the kind of thing that I'm hoping that the AI features that everybody is talking about in their quarterly reports might help us better understand opportunities to go back in refracts or other ways to complete wells and increase production for some of these old. But right now, I think operators are, for the most part, much more geared toward drilling new wells and reaching their production requirements in that fashion, since there's still undrilled prospects. Well, I have used up my time this fine morning, and thank you very much for your attention. We're always available should you have questions about what's going on, what might be going on. Our next update will be the first Friday of December, but in between now and then, we're always available for either a call, drop me an email, what have you, and we will get things done. And in the meantime, I hope everyone stays well, and we'll be seeing you soon. Thank you.